The thunderous crack of a six-shooter split the morning air as Xander Hawkins fanned the hammer, sending 3 bottles exploding into a shower of green glass against the backdrop of the Montana Territory's vast, unforgiving plains. It was 1877, and the West had become both his refuge and his prison. "You planning on wasting all my whiskey bottles, Hawk?" shouted Bernard Collier from the porch of his general store, squinting against the rising sun. Xander holstered his Colt with practiced precision, the leather worn smooth from years of the same motion. His eyes, blue as mountain lakes but cold as winter, barely acknowledged the storekeeper. "Put it on my tab," he said, his voice graveled by too many nights drinking and too many days eating dust. At 32, Xander carried himself like a much older man, the weight of his past evident in the slight stoop of his shoulders beneath his worn duster. "Tab's getting mighty long," Bernard muttered, but not loudly enough for Xander to hear as the cowboy mounted his dappled gray stallion and nudged it toward the edge of Silverdale, the small mining town that had reluctantly become his home 3 years prior. Silverdale wasn't much a clutch of wooden buildings huddled together against the wilderness, populated by miners, ranchers, and those running from something or someone. Xander fit right in among the latter, though few knew what shadows dogged him. He preferred it that way. The April sun climbed higher as Xander rode toward the Henderson ranch, where he worked as a hand. The golden light illuminated the scars on his knuckles, earned in countless saloon brawls and one particularly brutal stint with the Union Army during the war, a war that had ended 12 years ago, but still raged in his nightmares. "You're late, Hawkins," called Everett Henderson from the corral where he was breaking a spirited Mustang. "Thought maybe you'd finally drunk yourself to death." "Not yet," Xander replied flatly, dismounting with fluid grace that belied his haunted demeanor. "Just practicing." "Practicing for what? Another ghost from your past?" Henderson's laugh held no malice, just the rough camaraderie of men who worked the land together. Xander didn't answer. The ghosts were always there, his younger brother Thomas dying in his arms outside Vicksburg, his parents taken by fever the year he returned from the war, the woman in Kansas City who'd betrayed him to bounty hunters after he'd killed a man in self-defense. Some nights, all he could do was shoot bottles and hope the memories would shatter just as easily. "Got a job for you," Henderson continued, sensing Xander's darkening mood. "Stage is bringing in my niece from Boston today. Need you to fetch her from town." Xander's jaw tightened. "Send Williams." "I've got fences to mend on the north pasture." Williams couldn't find his way to town with a map and a compass. "Besides," Henderson added with a sly grin, "she's bringing all manner of luggage, needs someone strong." There was no use arguing. Xander nodded curtly and set about his morning chores, mucking stalls and feeding horses, his movements efficient but mechanical. By midday, he was back in the saddle, heading toward Silverdale with a reluctance that sat heavy in his chest. He had no patience for Eastern ladies with their frilly dresses and horror of dust and cattle. The stagecoach was just pulling in when Xander arrived, its wheels stirring up clouds of tan dirt that danced in the afternoon light. He hung back, watching as the driver secured the team and passengers began to disembark, first a salesman with a case of trinkets, then an older couple who looked relieved to be on solid ground. Last came a young woman in a practical blue traveling dress, her honey-brown hair caught up in a simple knot at the nape of her neck. She moved with a quiet confidence, thanking the driver who handed down her trunk. When she turned, scanning the small gathering for a familiar face, Xander was struck by the clarity of her hazel eyes and the determined set of her chin. "Miss Henderson," he called, stepping forward with his hat in his hands. She smiled, a genuine, warm expression that caught him off guard. "I'm Clara Valenti, Everett's niece, and you must be Mr. Hawkins. Uncle mentioned you in his letters." Xander frowned slightly. He hadn't realized Henderson wrote about him. "Just Xander is fine, madam. I'm here to take you to the ranch." Clara tilted her head, studying him with unexpected directness. "Just Clara, then. I'm not one for formalities." Something in her gaze made him uncomfortable, as if she could see past the carefully constructed barriers he'd built around himself. He cleared his throat, reaching for her trunk. "It's a fair ride to the ranch. Hope you're not too tired from your journey." "I've been sitting for days," she replied cheerfully. "A ride sounds wonderful." As they secured her belongings to Xander's horse and a borrowed mare from the livery, he noticed her hands not soft and pampered as he'd expected, but capable, with a small callus on her right middle finger. "You write a lot?" he asked before he could stop himself. Clara looked surprised, then pleased. "I do. I keep journals and I write articles occasionally for ladies' periodicals in Boston." She flexed her fingers. "Gave myself this callus before I was 12. My father said I'd wear my pencils down to nubs." Xander helped her mount, noting how naturally she sat in the saddle. Another surprise. "Your father teach you to ride?" A shadow crossed her face. "He did. He passed last winter, pneumonia." "I'm sorry," Xander said, and meant it. "Thank you." She straightened, adjusting her skirts. "It's part of why I came west. Too many memories in Boston." Uncle Everett's offer to help run the household seemed like a fresh start. They rode in companionable silence for a while, the rhythm of hoofbeats punctuated by the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead. Xander found himself stealing glances at Clara, at the way the sunlight caught the auburn highlights in her hair, at the quiet strength in her posture. "Uncle mentioned you're quite the marksman," Clara said eventually. "Said you can shoot the eye out of a needle at 50 paces. Xander snorted. "Henderson exaggerates. He also said you rarely smile and never talk about your past." "That part's true enough." Xander's tone made it clear the topic was closed. Clara didn't press, but there was a thoughtfulness in her expression that made Xander uneasy. Most people in Silverdale had learned not to ask questions about his history. The few who tried usually encountered a wall of silence, or if they were particularly persistent, a dangerous glint in his eye that warned them away. "Well," Clara said lightly, "the past is just that, past. I'm more interested in the present, and presently I'd like to know what I should expect at the ranch." Uncle's letters were somewhat vague on the details. For the next hour, Xander found himself answering her questions about the ranch operations, the other hands, the nearest neighbors. She listened intently, asking intelligent questions that revealed she wasn't just making conversation. She was genuinely interested in understanding the workings of her new home. By the time they crested the final hill that overlooked Henderson Ranch, the sun was beginning to dip toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the valley. The main house stood sturdy and welcoming, smoke curling from the chimney. Nearby, the bunkhouse, barn, and various outbuildings formed a rough semicircle. Beyond stretched acres of grazing land where Henderson's cattle dotted the landscape like dark pebbles. "It's beautiful," Clara breathed, reining in her horse to take in the view. Xander watched her face, surprised by the genuine appreciation he saw there. "It has its moments," he admitted. "I can see why Uncle loves it so. It feels like freedom." She turned to him, that smile illuminating her face again. "Don't you think?" Xander found himself unable to look away from her radiance. For one unguarded moment, he felt something stir within him, something he'd thought long dead. "It can be," he said softly, "for those who deserve it." The moment hung between them, fragile and unexpected, until the sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the spell. Henderson rode toward them, waving enthusiastically. "Clara, my girl, you made it," he called. Clara urged her horse forward, leaving Xander to follow more slowly, already rebuilding the walls that had momentarily weakened in her presence. That night, after a hearty welcome dinner at the main house, Xander retreated to the bunkhouse earlier than usual. The other hands were still celebrating Clara's arrival with music and stories. But Xander had grown increasingly uncomfortable with how often he found his gaze drawn to her animated face as she charmed everyone around the table. He sat on his bunk, cleaning his revolver by lamplight, a ritual that usually calmed his mind. Tonight, however, his thoughts kept circling back to hazel eyes and a smile that seemed to reach right into the darkness he carried. "Fool," he muttered to himself. Women like Clara Valenti weren't for men like him, men with blood on their hands and prices on their heads. The bounty for that killing in Kansas might have been dropped years ago, after witnesses came forward confirming self-defense. But the blood his brothers, the enemy soldiers, the man who'd drawn on him too slowly that never washed away. Over the next few weeks, Xander did his best to avoid Clara, volunteering for the most distant work on the ranch. But Henderson's property wasn't large enough to escape her entirely. He'd find her helping Mrs. Wilkins in the garden, or reading on the porch, or sometimes riding out to bring lunch to the hands. Each time, she'd offer that same warm smile and engage him in conversation that he tried to keep brief, but somehow never managed to. It was a Tuesday morning in late May when everything changed. Xander was repairing a section of fence when Clara rode up, her hair in a simple braid down her back, wearing a divided riding skirt that scandalized the town but made perfect sense on the ranch. "Mr. Williams said you might need these," she called, holding up a sack of fence staples. Xander nodded his thanks, trying not to notice how the morning sun brought out the gold flecks in her eyes. Clara dismounted, tying her horse beside his to a nearby tree. Instead of leaving the staples and returning to the house as he expected, she rolled up her sleeves. "Show me how to do this," she said, gesturing to the fence. "Miss Valenti, Clara," she corrected firmly. "Clara," he conceded. "This isn't ladies' work." She raised an eyebrow. "And who decided that? The same people who think women shouldn't vote or own property." "I've been watching the operations for 3 weeks now, Xander. I'm not here to play at being a rancher's niece. I intend to learn everything I can." Her determination caught him off guard, and he found himself demonstrating how to stretch the wire and secure it. She was a quick study, her small hands surprisingly strong as she worked alongside him. "You're good at this," he admitted after an hour of working together. "I'm good at lots of things," she replied with a mischievous glint in her eye. "Most people just don't bother to find out." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the spring breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers from the nearby meadow. Occasionally, their hands would brush, sending an unexpected jolt through Xander's body each time. "You know," Clara said eventually, hammering a staple into a post with more force than necessary, "for someone who barely talks, you say quite a lot." Xander paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "What's that supposed to mean, the way you avoid looking people in the eye? How you flinch when someone mentions the war? The fact that you practice shooting at dawn most days as if you're expecting trouble?" She set down her hammer, meeting his gaze directly. "You're carrying something heavy, Xander Hawkins, something that's eating you alive." Anger flared within him, not at her observation, which was accurate enough, but at the fact that she'd noticed it all, that she'd been watching him, thinking about him. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said coldly, turning back to the fence. "Don't I?" She stepped closer, fearless in a way that both infuriated and fascinated him. I recognize grief, Xander. I see how it sits on your shoulders. I know because I carry my own. It's not just grief, he said before he could stop himself. Then what is it? He met her eyes, his own hard as flint. Guilt. Blood. Things a woman like you shouldn't have to hear about. Clara didn't back down. A woman like me has seen her father waste away coughing blood, has watched her mother die in childbirth along with the baby when I was 14, has buried both and left everything familiar behind to start again. Her voice trembled slightly, but her gaze remained steady. Don't presume to know what I can bear to hear, Xander. The silence between them hummed with tension. For a moment, Xander saw past his own darkness to recognize the quiet strength in her, a resilience forged through her own trials. I'm sorry, he said finally, the words feeling rusty in his mouth. About your family, she nodded, accepting his apology without pressing for more. They returned to their work, but something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement that they were both carrying burdens, both seeking some kind of redemption in the vast openness of the West. When they finished the fence section, Clara helped him gather the tools. As she handed him the hammer, their fingers brushed again, but this time Xander didn't pull away quite so quickly. Would you teach me to shoot sometime? She asked unexpectedly. He blinked in surprise. Why would you want to learn that? Because it's a useful skill out here. And she added with that direct gaze that seemed to see right through him, because maybe if I understand why it's so important to you, I'll understand you better. Xander should have refused, should have maintained the distance he'd carefully cultivated. Instead, he heard himself say, tomorrow morning, dawn, bring gloves, the grip will blister your hands otherwise. Her smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. The next morning, Clara met him at the edge of Henderson's property, dressed practically in her riding skirt and a simple blouse, her hair braided tightly against her head. She'd brought gloves as instructed, and her expression was one of eager determination. Xander had spent a restless night questioning his decision to agree to this, but seeing her there in the soft morning light, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. He'd brought his spare revolver, a slightly smaller Remington that would fit her hands better than his Colt. First rule, he said, his tone more serious than she'd ever heard it, is that you never, ever point this at anything you don't intend to destroy. Clara nodded solemnly, listening intently as he explained the mechanics of loading, cocking, and firing. When he finally placed the revolver in her gloved hands, she held it with appropriate caution. It's heavier than I expected, she admitted. Death always is, he replied quietly. He positioned her, adjusting her stance and the angle of her arms, trying to ignore how his heart raced when he stood close behind her, his hands guiding hers. The scent of lavender from her hair momentarily distracted him. Focus on the bottle, he instructed, his voice low near her ear. Breathe out as you squeeze the trigger. Don't pull, squeeze. Clara's first shot went wide, the report causing a flock of birds to rise startled from a nearby tree. She gasped at the recoil, but her eyes lit with determination rather than fear. Again, she said. By her sixth attempt, she'd managed to graze one of the bottles, sending it spinning but not breaking. Her triumphant laugh stirred something in Xander's chest, something he hadn't felt in years. Not bad for a first lesson, he admitted, taking the revolver to reload it. When did you learn? She asked, flexing her hands. Xander hesitated, then said, My pa taught me when I was 12, said a man should know how to protect what's his. Did you protect what was yours? There was no judgment in her question, just genuine curiosity. He looked away, focusing on the distant mountains. Not always, not when it mattered most. Clara was quiet for a moment, then she stepped closer, her voice gentle. Would you tell me about what happened? Perhaps it was the early morning solitude, or the way she'd looked at the gun with respect rather than fear, or simply the weeks of her steady presence wearing down his defenses. Whatever the reason, Xander found himself speaking of things he hadn't voiced in years. My brother Thomas was 17 when the war broke out. I was 22. We both enlisted with the Union. Pa was proud, said we were fighting on the right side of history. He swallowed hard. Thomas shouldn't have been there. He was too young, too gentle, but he wouldn't let me go alone. Clara listened silently, her eyes never leaving his face. Vicksburg, 63. We were advancing through a wooded area. I was point man. Should have seen the Confederate sharpshooter. His voice grew hoarse. The bullet was meant for me. Thomas pushed me aside, took it right through the chest. "Oh, Xander," Clara whispered. "He died in my arms. Last thing he said was that he wasn't afraid." Xander's hands tightened around the revolver. "But I saw his eyes, Clara. He was terrified. And there wasn't a damn thing I could do except watch him go." Clara reached out, her small hand covering his. "It wasn't your fault, wasn't it?" His laugh was bitter. "I was the one who talked about glory and duty when the war started. I was the one who should have protected him." "You were both men making your own choices," she said firmly. "Thomas chose to save you. That was his decision, his love for you." Xander pulled away, unable to accept the absolution in her words. "After the war, I drifted, took odd jobs, ended up in Kansas City working security for a saloon, got tangled up with a woman there, Jessie. Thought maybe I could start fresh." His jaw tightened. "One night a drunk pulled a gun on me. I was faster. He died." Clara nodded, understanding crossing her features. "Self-defense. The law saw it that way eventually. But not before Jessie turned me in to some bounty hunters for the reward money. Turned out the man I killed had connections, people willing to pay to see me hang, legal or not." "That's why you practice shooting every morning," Clara said softly. "You're still looking over your shoulder." "Old habits," he shrugged. "Came west to outrun it all. Thought dust and distance might bury the past." "Has it worked, you tell me?" he said, meeting her eyes at last. Clara studied him, her gaze compassionate but not pitying. "I think the past only stays buried if you put it to rest properly. Not with dust, but with forgiveness, especially of yourself." They stood in silence as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the grass. In the distance, a lone coyote called, its cry echoing across the valley. "Show me how to hit that bottle," Clara finally said, nodding toward the untouched target. Grateful for the change in subject, Xander positioned her once more, this time standing beside her rather than behind. "Remember, breathe out as you squeeze." Clara fired, and the bottle exploded in a shower of glass. Her face lit up with delight, and without thinking, Xander found himself smiling, a real smile that reached his eyes for the first time in longer than he could remember. "I did it," she exclaimed, turning to him with such joy that he was momentarily breathless. "You're a natural," he said, surprised by the warmth in his own voice. "I had a good teacher." Her eyes lingered on his face. "You should smile more often, Xander Hawkins. It suits you." Before he could respond, she leaned forward and pressed a quick, soft kiss to his cheek, then stepped back, a blush coloring her face. I'm sorry," she stammered. "I don't know why I did that." Xander touched his cheek, stunned by the gesture and even more by how much he wanted her to do it again. "Don't apologize," he said quietly. The moment hung between them, full of possibility. Then Clara straightened, handing him back the revolver. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked, her voice steadier than her flushed cheeks would suggest. Xander nodded, not trusting himself to speak. As she mounted her horse and rode back toward the ranch, he remained standing among the broken glass, feeling as though something long dormant within him had begun to stir back to life. Over the next month, Their early morning shooting lessons became a ritual, one that gradually extended into breakfasts together, long rides checking the property boundaries, and evenings on the porch swing where Clara would read aloud from her favorite books while Xander listened, finding unexpected solace in the cadence of her voice. Henderson watched their growing closeness with barely concealed satisfaction. "Never thought I'd see the day," he commented to Mrs. Wilkins one evening as they observed Clara teaching Xander to dance in the yard, lamplight spilling from the windows as she counted steps, and he followed with uncharacteristic patience. "She's good for him," Mrs. Wilkins agreed. "Brings the light back to his eyes." Indeed, the change in Xander was remarkable to those who had known him before. He still carried his ghost, still practiced his shooting, still woke sometimes with nightmares that left him sweating and disoriented, but there was a softness to him now, a willingness to engage rather than withdraw. For Clara's part, she bloomed in the western landscape, taking on increasingly more responsibility at the ranch. Henderson boasted to anyone who would listen that his niece had a better head for figures than any banker in Montana Territory. It was late June when trouble finally caught up to Xander. He and Clara were in town picking up supplies when he noticed 3 men watching him from outside the saloon, strangers with the hard eyes of men who killed for money. "Take the wagon back to the ranch," he told Clara quietly, loading the last sack of flour. She caught the tension in his voice immediately. "What's wrong?" "Just some men I'd rather not meet." He helped her onto the wagon seat, his movements deliberately casual. "I'll catch up later." Clara's gaze sharpened. "The bounty hunters, I thought that was settled years ago." "Different men, same purpose," he said grimly. "Some people have long memories and deep pockets." "I'm not leaving you," she stated, her chin set in that stubborn angle he'd come to both admire and expect. "Clara, no," she cut him off. "Whatever's coming, we face it together." Before he could argue further, the 3 men approached, spreading out slightly to block any easy escape route. The leader, a weathered man with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, stepped forward. "Xander Hawkins," he drawled. "Been a long time coming." Xander's hand hovered near his holster. "Whatever you're being paid, it's not worth dying for." The man chuckled. "Maybe not, but $1,500 will buy a lot of comfort for my widow." Clara's intake of breath was audible, but she kept her composure. "Gentlemen," she said with remarkable steadiness, "I believe you're operating under outdated information. Mr. Hawkins was cleared of all charges related to the Kansas City incident. I have documentation to prove it." The scarred man looked at her with amused condescension. "With all due respect, madam, this ain't about legal charges. This is about Clayton Mercer's father wanting revenge for his boy." "Clayton Mercer pulled his gun first," Xander said evenly. "Even his own friends testified to that. Don't matter to old man Mercer. You killed his only son." The man's hand drifted closer to his own revolver. "Now, I'd rather not have to shoot a lady, so if you'd kindly step down from that wagon." Xander tensed, calculating odds that looked increasingly grim. 3 against 1 with Clara in the crossfire. Even with his speed, the chances of everyone walking away were slim. What happened next occurred so quickly that later accounts varied. Clara reached beneath the wagon seat and produced a small derringer that Xander hadn't known she carried. She fired a single shot into the air, the sound cracking through the suddenly silent street. "That's enough," came a commanding voice from behind the bounty hunters. Sheriff Dawson stood there, his shotgun leveled at the group. Beside him were 2 deputies and, surprisingly, Bernard Collier from the general store, all armed and resolute. "These men are threatening Mr. Hawkins," Clara called out, her derringer now pointed steadily at the scarred leader. "They've admitted to coming here for vigilante justice, not legal arrest." The sheriff nodded. I heard, and I don't take kindly to outsiders bringing trouble to my town. His gaze hardened. Especially not to a man who's pulled half my citizens' children from a flash flood and never asked for so much as a thank you. Xander blinked in surprise. He'd helped with the rescue during spring rains the previous year, but he'd never imagined the town had taken particular note of it. The standoff stretched taut for several heartbeats before the scarred man slowly raised his hands. "No need for bloodshed today," he said carefully. "We were just having a conversation." "Conversation's over," Sheriff Dawson replied flatly. "You boys can spend the night in my jail to cool off, then be on the first stage out tomorrow morning. And you can tell Mercer that Hawkins is under the protection of Silverdale now. He comes after one of ours again, he'll have a whole town to deal with." As the deputies disarmed and escorted the bounty hunters away, Xander found himself speechless, looking from the sheriff to Bernard to Clara, trying to make sense of what had just happened. "You didn't think we'd let them just gun you down in the street, did you?" Bernard asked gruffly. "Damn fool. You've been buying supplies from me for 3 years. Your money's as good as anyone's." Clara reached for Xander's hand, squeezing it tightly. "See," she said softly, "you're not as alone as you thought." Later that evening, after they'd returned to the ranch and recounted the day's events to a concerned Henderson, Xander and Clara walked together along the creek that marked the eastern boundary of the property. The setting sun painted the water in shades of gold and crimson, while fireflies began to rise from the tall grass. "You could have been killed today," Xander said, breaking the comfortable silence. Clara looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the sunset. "So could you. I'm used to that risk." "Well, you shouldn't be." She stopped walking, turning to face him fully. "Not anymore." Xander studied her face, the determination in her eyes, the slight furrow between her brows, the soft curve of her lips that he'd thought about kissing more times than he cared to admit. "Why do you care so much?" he asked, the question that had been burning in him for weeks finally finding voice. Clara's expression softened. "Because from the moment I met you, I saw someone worth caring about. Someone who carries his pain like armor but still manages to be gentle when it matters. Someone who thinks he deserves to be alone but actually deserves so much more." She stepped closer, her hand coming up to rest against his chest, right above his heart. "I care because I've watched you smile more each day, because I've seen the man beneath the dust and shadows. Because she took a deep breath. Because I've fallen in love with you, Xander Hawkins. God help me." The world seemed to still around them. Xander covered her hand with his own, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm, a heart he'd thought beyond repair now pounding with renewed purpose. "I don't deserve you," he whispered. "That's not for you to decide," she replied simply. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Xander lowered his head and brushed his lips against hers. Clara responded immediately, her free hand coming up to curl around the nape of his neck as she kissed him back with a warmth that melted years of frozen grief. When they finally parted, Xander rested his forehead against hers, breathing in the lavender scent that had become his favorite in the world. "I love you too," he said, the words feeling both foreign and perfect on his tongue. "Have since you shot that bottle and looked at me like I'd given you the moon," Clara laughed softly. "And here I thought it was my brilliant conversation that won you over." "That too," he admitted with a small smile. "Everything about you, Clara Valenti. You dug up something in me I thought was long dead." "Hope," she said, understanding in her eyes. "Hope," he agreed, "and a future I might actually deserve." They stood together as the last light faded from the sky, the stars emerging one by one above them. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Xander felt no urge to look over his shoulder, no weight of guilt pressing down on him. Instead, There was only Clara in his arms and the promise of tomorrow stretching out before them, a promise that now felt worth keeping. 3 months later, with summer giving way to fall, Xander stood beside Clara at the altar of Silverdale's small church. She wore a simple white dress, adorned with wildflowers she'd gathered herself that morning, her hair loose around her shoulders the way he loved best. He wore a new black suit, his silver pocket watch the only heirloom he had from his father gleaming against the dark fabric. The entire town had turned out for the wedding, along with ranchers from miles around. Even Mrs. Wilkins was crying openly, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief as Clara and Xander exchanged vows in clear, steady voices that carried to the back of the packed room. "I take you, Clara Valenti, as my wife," Xander said, the words flowing easily now that the moment had arrived. "I promise to protect you, respect you, and walk beside you through whatever life brings us. You found me when I was lost in darkness and showed me there was still light worth fighting for. I give you my name, my heart, and my future, all that I am and all that I will be." Clara's eyes shimmered with tears as she responded, "I take you, Xander Hawkins, as my husband. I promise to support you, challenge you, and remind you of your own strength whenever you forget it. You taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear but facing it anyway. I give you my trust, my love, and my partnership for all the days we're granted together." As they exchanged rings, simple gold bands that caught the light streaming through the church windows, Henderson beamed proudly from the front pew. When the preacher finally pronounced them husband and wife, Xander didn't wait for permission to kiss his bride. He gathered Clara in his arms and kissed her with a tenderness that spoke of all they'd overcome and all they had yet to discover together. The celebration afterward lasted well into the night, with dancing, feasting, and more goodwill than Xander had ever experienced directed his way. As Clara danced with Henderson, her face alight with joy, Bernard sidled up to Xander with 2 glasses of whiskey. "Never thought I'd see you looking so damn happy," the storekeeper commented, handing him a drink. Xander accepted it with a nod of thanks. "Never thought I'd feel it." Bernard raised his glass, "to burying the past." "And to what grows in its place," Xander added, clinking his glass against Bernard's before taking a sip. Later, as the night deepened and the party showed no signs of slowing, Xander and Clara slipped away, mounting their horses for the ride back to the small cabin Xander had spent the summer building on a corner of Henderson's property, their wedding gift from Clara's uncle. Under a vast canopy of stars, they rode side by side, the future stretching before them as boundless as the Montana sky. Clara reached across the space between them, her hand finding his with the ease of long practice. "Happy?" she asked, though his expression already told her the answer. Xander squeezed her hand, the gold of his wedding band catching the moonlight. "More than I ever thought possible." As they crested the hill that overlooked their new home, Xander Hawkins realized that the past he'd tried so desperately to bury beneath dust and distance hadn't disappeared. It had simply found its proper place in the story of his life. Not as a weight dragging him down, but as the foundation upon which he and Clara would build something new and beautiful together. And all it had taken was one woman's smile and a kiss brave enough to reach past his defenses and uncover the hope he'd hidden even from himself.